Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Democracy Talk in Manila, an online discussion on the role of youth voices in democracy. My name is Naila Prieto. I am with the Asia and the Pacific Program of International IDEA, one of the organizers of this webinar, and I will be your host and moderator for this session. So in the next 90 minutes, we look forward to an informal but fruitful and dynamic discussion on the state of Philippine democracy, how it compares in the region and globally. We also look forward to a dialogue among our youth discussants on what they perceive are the challenges and opportunities to democracy amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. At this webinar, let us ask the questions and hopefully identify some recommendations for continued dialogue and inspire more youth voices. This webinar is brought to you by the Swedish Embassy in Manila, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, or International IDEA, and the Center for Integrative and Development Studies of the University of the Philippines. Before we start the program, please allow me to go through a couple of house rules. So during the session, please keep your microphone on mute and your video turned off. Leave any questions for our speakers and discussants using the Q&A box that you see on your screen. Links to the resource materials that will be presented here will be emailed together with the post-event feedback forms. If you require certificate of attendance, this can be requested and issued after the webinar. Also, for your information, the webinar is live streamed on YouTube. Now, to formally open our program, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, His Excellency Harold Friis, Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of the Philippines. Prior to this post, Ambassador Friis has held various positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including a stint at the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the UN in New York, and head of the UN section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Early on his diplomatic career, the ambassador was also posted at the Swedish Embassy in Manila. So please allow me, Ambassador Harold Friis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Naila, and good afternoon to all of you, or good morning, depending on which time zone you're in. It's great to see that so many are joining us today, despite that today there's a non-working holiday in the Philippines. And my sincere appreciation goes to International IDEA and the University of the Philippines for co-organizing this event together with the Embassy of Sweden. And a special greeting to the Secretary General of International IDEA, Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora. We're honored to have you with us. I know you're calling in from Stockholm, my hometown. Democracy is the best foundation for human rights and rule of law, and for a fair, decent, and sustainable society. A strong democracy creates economic prosperity, peace, and security. Unfortunately, there are those that have other priorities, and that is why democracy is under threat in many parts of the world. Today, more people are living in countries with authoritarian tendencies than in countries where democracy is gaining ground. And this negative trend is compounded by the corona pandemic. This pandemic has the gravest impact on the poorest people, and particularly on individuals who already are marginalized or discriminated against. And there is the risk that leaders use the pandemic as a pretext to violate human rights in order to silence opposition, civil society, or human rights defenders. Because of this, the Swedish government launched this year a global drive for democracy with a project called Democracy Talks. Through these democracy talks in many countries around the globe, we want to contribute to the international discussion on how we best can promote and protect democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Our drive for democracy focuses particularly on engaging the youth. Students, youth activists, and youth groups are essential actors in a vibrant democracy. I'm really very happy, therefore, to welcome several youth organizations and so many young people to this democracy talk. And I now look forward to hearing our expert speakers and youth leaders of their perspectives on the current state of democracy globally and here in the Philippines, and how youth participation can be strengthened. Thank you very much, and back to you, Naila.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fries. Now, to deliver the welcome remarks, I am pleased to introduce our Secretary General, the Secretary General of International IDEA, Dr. Kevin Casas-Zamora. Kevin has more than 5-year experience in democratic governance as a researcher, analyst, educator, and a public official. Kevin has had the rare combination of having a distinguished academic career focused on democratic institutions and electoral systems, and as a former high-level public official in his home country, Costa Rica. Kevin, I hand over the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Naila, and thank you, Ambassador Fries, for the very kind introduction. And good afternoon, good morning, or good evening to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. I am both honored and very happy that we are organizing today's event together with the Swedish Embassy in Manila. As you might know, and Ambassador Fries just mentioned this, Sweden has been the chair of the Council of Member States of International IDEA this year, and I truly value Sweden's unwavering support to our work and to democracy. The fact that you have made democracy a priority of your foreign policy, and within that you launch the Global Drive for Democracy, is a powerful testament to that commitment. In addition, I'm particularly glad that today's discussion is going to focus on the role of young voices in democracy, as this topic goes to the heart of International IDEA's mission of advancing sustainable democracy worldwide. And here I would like to emphasize the word sustainable, which for us means more than just defending, preserving, and supporting democracy. Of course, we need to do all that in today's world, but increasingly I am convinced that we need to make democracy sustainable for the future. We must rethink, reform, and revitalize democracy to better be able to cope with current and future challenges, including intergenerational challenges such as climate change or the technological transformation of our societies. Young people all over the world should be at the heart of this transformation, as they are the ones who are going to pay the price and live in the world formed by decisions taken today, more often than not without their input. This is why I'm particularly happy about today's topic of discussion, which will include reflections on the current state of democracy in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, both in the Philippines and beyond. But more fundamentally, it would also include an exchange with young people about what democracy means to them and the role that they see democracy having in the future. These discussions are vital and fascinating, and very much in line with one of the focus areas during our 25th anniversary conference a few weeks ago, where we explored the topic of sustainable democracy and the nexus between youth, democracy, and climate change. And it was enlightening to see how knowledgeable, articulate, and insightful our young participants were, and how they were able to conclude that sustainable democracy is built through access to information and education, through inclusive participation, and through the eradication of inequalities, marginalization, and discrimination. This is very important. I was particularly struck by the extent to which the young voices that took part in our conference saw the fate of democracy linked to the struggle against inequality. Inequality in rights, but also inequality in real access to opportunities. And on that score, they're right. We tend to forget the extent to which equality is a foundational principle of democracy on a par with freedom. And the fact is that the obscene levels of socioeconomic inequality that we're witnessing in the world, and that this pandemic, I'm afraid, will only worsen, are simply incompatible with democracy as a tool to distribute power and to protect human dignity. Young people know that, and that's important knowledge to have. Now we must help them to turn that conscience into action. I'm truly interested to find out what insights today's discussions will yield. As I know, there will be a remarkable panel addressing these issues. And here, I'm also glad to see our long-term partners, the Center for Integrative and Development Studies at the University of the Philippines, who we have worked with in conducting many activities in the past, including our annual Melbourne Forum. But before we get to the panel discussions, my colleagues from the Asia Pacific Regional Office will make a presentation based on the findings from our global monitor on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights, a tool that we developed earlier this year with the support of the European Union, which covers 162 countries and which we update constantly. And here, please let me just very briefly say a few words about some of the main findings so far. As we all know, democracy was facing severe headwinds even before the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. In many democracies, developed and underdeveloped, young ones as much as established ones, checks and balances were becoming weaker, civic spaces were shrinking, and freedom of expression was under sustained assault. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated many of the vulnerabilities and deficits of democratic systems around the world. We now know that all countries imposed some kind of restrictions on basic freedoms and democratic rights during the COVID-19 pandemic. And the use of emergency powers can be legitimate for democracies, up to a point. However, according to our global monitor, over 100 countries have implemented measures which are concerning from a democracy and human rights perspective, because they were either disproportionate, illegal, indefinite, or simply unnecessary in relation to the public health threat. Under the guise of the pandemic, authoritarian leaders have tightened their grip on power, silenced critics, and trampled further on fundamental rights. All over the world, we have seen cases where emergency powers have been invoked to do things that have nothing to do with the pandemic and everything to do with the intention of shutting down critical voices, limiting civic spaces, and harassing minorities. In all of this, I'm particularly concerned about trends related to press freedom. And I'm also concerned about the alarming number of countries where governments have limited citizens' access to information under the pretext of fighting disinformation. Over 50 countries in the world, including 20 plus democracies, have introduced measures that visibly compromise the ability of independent media outlets to do their job. Others have prohibited demonstrations, hindered civil society organizations, and closed down education beyond what's reasonable, to the point where the UN is now warning about the loss of an entire generation. We cannot be bystanders to all of this. Democracy dies in silence, without information and freedom of expression, without knowledge, without participation, and without a voice. And this is why these democracy talks are so important, because this is the time to speak up and defend democracy. We must understand that there's nothing inevitable about the advance and sustainability of democracy. Democracy is neither created nor maintained by itself. It is something that requires continuous vigilance, dedication, and support. If we truly care, as I think we all do, about the future of democracy, this is the time to build local, national, regional, and global coalitions to protect it. That's what we're doing here. In fact, we need to go beyond defending democracy. The very magnitude of this crisis is opening up opportunities to reinvent democracy, to align it to the interests and ideals of young people so that they are willing to defend it with conviction. We need to seize these opportunities for renewal with both hands. That's also what we're doing here. Each of us needs to stand up for democracy and translate that commitment into actions, knowing full well that while the values we defend are eternal, our victories are always subject to reversal. Now, more than ever, we must dare to make the case for democracy with confidence and a sense of urgency. It is a case that in the Philippines, as much as in the rest of the world, has not lost 1 ounce of its power to inspire and give light in this season of darkness. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We are indeed grateful for this opportunity to be part of Sweden's global drive for democracy. And it being International IDEA's 25th year, the timing is perfect as some democracies is at a crossroads, especially with the pandemic situation. And as you mentioned, Kevin, more than ever, we need to find ways to defend, sustain, and revitalize democracy and fully engage the youth. Let me then segue to our next speaker, who will give us an overview on the state of Philippine democracy and International IDEA's global monitor on COVID-19's impact on democracy and human rights. To present this, I am pleased to introduce Amanda Katz-Barrell, the Program Manager of International IDEA's My Constitution program in Myanmar. Amanda also serves as Regional Advisor on Constitution Building in Asia and the Pacific, where she supports constitution building processes in various contexts. And she also manages the Melbourne Forum, a regional network of practitioners and scholars on constitution building in Asia and the Pacific. So Amanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nyla. Sorry for the delay. I'd like to confirm that you can see my screen. Is that possible, Athena?
Yes, I can see it.
We can see it. But
Excellent.
you can full screen the screen. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Nyla, for the introduction and to everyone for joining today's program. I'm very excited to be part of this collaboration between International IDEA, the Embassy of Sweden in the Philippines, the Center for Integrative and Development Studies at the University of the Philippines, and our dynamic youth discussants and the organizations that they represent. I'm Amanda Katz-Barrell, and as Nyla mentioned, I work as International IDEA's Regional Advisor on Constitution Building for Asia and the Pacific. In this role, I support International IDEA in closely monitoring COVID responses around the region, particularly insofar as they implicate constitutional structures like separation of powers and intergovernmental relations, and other constitutional issues like state of emergency declarations and restrictions on fundamental rights. I have also had the honor of partnering with the University of the Philippines and other partners on behalf of International IDEA to support discussions around constitutional change, or CHA-CHA, here in the Philippines over the last 3 years. This process has ebbed, but has always required an evidence base, namely an objective assessment of how the 1987 Constitution is performing towards its own stated goals of delivering and sustaining democracy. We believe this is central to grounding discussions about whether this Constitution should be changed. In partnership with the University of the Philippines, IDEA produced such an assessment, and we've updated it after the COVID pandemic. In my presentation today, I will reflect on these themes, on the global state of democracy assessment indices that we have as International IDEA and the COVID monitor, and also how these apply to the Philippines. Many of the global statistics were already shared by our Secretary General, so I will not go over them in detail, but I have included them in the slide to contextualize our discussion of the Philippines country profile. On the screen, you'll see the global state of democracy framework. This serves as the basis for International IDEA's monitoring of democracy around the world. We have country profiles and regional profiles, and all of the data is available online, so we encourage you to explore it at your leisure. Part of the intention of the framework is to make this information transparent and available to people around the world. The core attributes of democracy that we recognize are pictured at the center of the diagram here, and you'll see that this diagram is now reflected in the country profile for the Philippines. The colors represent different levels of performance according to the different attributes of democracy. As you'll see, based on our GSOD country profile for the Philippines has been a functioning democracy since we began collecting this data in 1975. From 1975 to 1985, under the Marcos regime, there was a period of non-democracy in the Philippines, but with the passage of the 1987 Constitution, we see that democracy has been sustained and uninterrupted in the Philippines since then. That being said, we have monitored a slight backsliding in 2019, beginning in 2019 mainly, and continuing through the pandemic, which we'll discuss later. As you can see, however, based on the table on the right, the Philippines is a mid-range performing democracy. There's no areas of grave concern. There's also no areas of excelling particularly, but the democratic performance has been maintained and steady over the years, as you can see from that table. Globally speaking, the Philippines ranks in the world's top 25% for elected government and electoral participation. And in many ways, this testifies to how democracy has been consolidated in the Philippines over time with peaceful transfers of power and regular elections. The world's bottom 25%, however, also includes the Philippines when it comes to social group equality and issues of personal integrity and security, which we will discuss later. So this shows that there are still areas where democracy could be consolidated and improved in the Philippines. I won't dwell on this slide long, but this is meant to show how the Philippines compares to regional and global trends on democratic attributes. As you can see, the Philippines is represented by the pink line on these graphs, and the Asia Pacific region, the yellow line. Global perspective is represented by the dark blue line. You'll see that there's no significant deviation from regional and global trends when it comes to the Philippines' democratic performance over the period of time looked at by the GSOD. That being said, there is higher than average electoral participation, especially in the period running from approximately 1975 to 1995, and a sustained higher than average level of local democratic performance, which is interesting from the perspective of the Philippines pandemic response. So having introduced the GSOD profile, again, this was data that was collected previous to the pandemic's onset. But as Kevin mentioned earlier, International IDEA launched the COVID monitor with support from the European Union this year to look at how the pandemic has impacted democratic performance across the world and in regions and countries. One of the first responses to the pandemic in many places was to declare a state of emergency, and between March and September of 2020, more than half the countries in the world declared a national state of emergency because of the COVID-19 pandemic. By October 2020, about 43% of these countries had lifted their states of emergency. And this is interesting to note because one of the main issues, I think, when we look at the pandemic and the states of emergencies related to it is the uncertainty of the timeline. We are discussing now the development of vaccines, but there's still no clarity on when we will really be able to go back to what we could call the old normal. So looking at states of emergencies, it's important to look at what will trigger their endpoint as well. And this is particularly significant given that states of emergencies are often the basis upon which countries do restrict fundamental rights and freedoms. When it came to the Philippines, there was no state of emergency declared under the Constitution, but emergency expedited procedures that are included in the Constitution were used to pass the To Heal as One Act in March 2020. Before that act was passed, President Duterte declared other types of emergency using existing legislation in the Philippines, including the Public Health Concern Act and the Disaster Act. This is one of, I think, the notable things about the Philippines' response to the pandemic is its ability to use existing legislation and to avoid having to declare a constitutional state of emergency that might implicate martial law or other major changes in governance. As I mentioned, states of emergencies are often the basis for concerning democratic developments or restrictions on democratic principles and human rights. And we've seen that 62% of countries have implemented measures that are of a concern from a democracy and human rights perspective. The Philippines is no exception when it comes to this. So you'll see this is the wheel that I showed earlier, which reflects the GSOD data, but also the COVID monitor's perspective on the Philippines' response to the pandemic. The icon that's represented by a magnifying glass is highlighting areas of concern, whereas the exclamation point is of serious concern. So you see a total of 9 aspects to watch from a democracy and human rights perspective in the Philippines. Like our global state of democracy, the COVID monitor is available online, and you can explore what contributes to each of these indicators at your leisure again. But I would like to share a few specific developments that are included in the COVID monitor that have impacted democracy in the Philippines. These might come up in our discussion later, so I just want to highlight them to frame that. One is the consolidation of power in the executive and the lack of opposition in Congress. There's a sort of cult of personality around President Duterte, which makes oversight often difficult from the congressional standpoint, and this could potentially accelerate democratic backsliding that was already noted in the GSOD since 2019. The response in the Philippines has also been highly militarized, and we've seen the arrest of 120,000 people for alleged violations of curfew. There's also been reports of degrading treatment of people being detained. President Duterte was also quoted to have initiated a shoot to kill order in April for people violating curfew. And while this might sound shocking, I think it's important to note that both the militarized response and the rhetoric around the shoot to kill order interplay and are in line with existing trends that were already occurring in the Philippines and rhetoric that was circulating. So we've seen in the COVID monitor that often the pandemic hasn't necessarily initiated democratic decay, but has maybe accelerated, as our Secretary General mentioned, existing trends. And this seems to be true in the Philippines. In addition to those characteristics of the response, we've also seen the destruction and demolition of informal settlements, displacement of Indigenous peoples, and evictions of low-income families. This is particularly concerning because of the military response mentioned earlier and the potential for arrest of these people who might be left homeless and therefore have difficulties complying with the quarantine orders in the Philippines. We've also seen impacts on the peace process and ceasefire with the new People's Army. And it is worth noting that the To Heal as One Act does allow for criminal prosecution of journalists and others who spread false information related to COVID. So as again mentioned by our Secretary General, this is of concern that maybe the fight against disinformation actually ends up limiting the right to information. So with that brief overview, I want to thank you for your time and hand it back to Nyla.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that very informative presentation. It may be sobering at first glance, but let us hear the reaction and feedback on these findings from Dr. Maria L. Atienza. Ella is currently the convener of the Program on Social and Political Change at the UP-CIDS. Ella is also professor and former chair of UP Diliman's Department of Political Science. Ella is also editor of the Philippine Political Science Journal and has written extensively on local governance, devolution, human security, women, and gender issues. So Ella, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nyla. Good afternoon to all and good morning or good evening to others who may be in a different time zone as the Philippines. Let me share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, good.
So, yeah. Okay, so His Excellency Ambassador Freeze, Dr. Casa Zamora, to our friends in International IDEA, Lina, Amanda, and Naila, to our youth leaders who are our discussants a little later in the program, and of course, all the participants in this webinar on democracy talks in Manila, focusing on youth participation in democracy. I think most of the participants are young people, so hopefully this afternoon we can discuss some of the important issues related with democracy, particularly in the Philippines, but at the same time see some inspiring initiatives from our youth organizations represented here, and we can discuss what the youth can do in terms of promoting and protecting democracy. What I'll try to do very briefly this afternoon is to complement what Amanda has presented earlier. Basically focusing, Amanda has presented the results of the Global Monitor and how the Philippines is placed, comparatively speaking, when it comes to democracy, particularly during the period of since the pandemic. So I'll be sharing with you some of the findings of two recently finished activities and publications that we did with in partnership with International IDEA. Basically, it's a constitutional performance assessment of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. This is the primary product of 2 to 3 years of partnership with International IDEA. And after we published the constitutional performance assessment of the 1987 Philippine Constitution, summary of findings, and you can find this, the full document online. We published this in February, then we had the global pandemic, and in agreement with International IDEA, we decided to do a rapid follow-up assessment, and we came up with a constitutional performance assessment in the time of a pandemic, the 1987 Constitution, and the Philippines COVID-19 response. And both documents are available online. And we did the research through the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies, particularly the program on social and political change. I headed the program and the research, but I worked very closely with very eligible and very competent colleagues from the Department of Political Science of the University of the Philippines. Briefly, what we tried to do was to use the constitutional performance methodology that was actually developed by International IDEA. It was first used in analyzing the performance of the South African Constitution, and we were inspired by this, and with talks with the negotiations with International IDEA, we were inspired by using this methodology because it's a multi-pronged approach that allows a nuanced analysis of whether shortcomings in constitutional performance are a result of poor substance or poor implementation. And the constitutional performance methodology involved two criteria. One is internal criteria. The second one is external criteria. Internal criteria identified with the Constitution's self-defined goals. It is assessed by looking at what the constitutional provisions say about different institutions designed to meet this criteria, and compliance with the internal criteria assessed by looking at whether or not the technical requirements in the Constitution have been met. As regards external criteria, this is an assessment of the Constitution's design using normative criteria on what a Constitution should be and do in accordance with global practice and theory. So for the 1987 Philippine Constitution, we modified a bit some of the external criteria and following some of the literature on constitutional assessment worldwide. And we included democratization, decentralization, social justice, human rights and gender equality, peace and conflict resolution, and economic development as part of the external criteria. We also look at two different types of compliance. One is thin compliance, which is defined or can be observed through fairly straightforward evidence as to whether institutions were set up, the appointments required in the Constitution were made, and laws were adopted in a timely manner. Then there's this thick compliance, which meets the substantive goals set out in the Constitution and other normative goals used to assess a Constitution. For instance, how are these substantive goals done in practice? For the first assessment, the bigger assessment of the 1987 Constitution before COVID, we used a lot of interviews, focus group discussions. Some of us used some surveys and literature review to come up with our assessment. And we were able to identify 9 systematic areas of analysis, and we identified them as constitutional design areas. I will not have time to discuss all of them today, but many of the findings actually coincide with the results for the Philippines in the Global Monitor, although more qualitative in nature for our findings. But basically, for the first general assessment, what we found out, and I quote the summary and conclusion of our first report last February, is that overall, there is only thin compliance with internal criteria used in the performance assessment. And this means that many of the technical requirements of the 1987 Constitution have been met in terms of setting up certain mandated institutions, holding processes such as elections, and enacting necessary laws and actions. But we also found out that thick or substantial compliance in terms of meeting the goals set in the Constitution is still wanting. And in addition, some laws mandated by the Constitution have not yet been enacted. For example, in terms of elections, there are no laws yet that allow for easy access to the exercise of electoral rights on the part of people with disabilities and elderly or more senior people. At the same time, also, some of the provisions in the Constitution related with limiting or banning political dynasties have no equivalent republic acts. Externally, although notable progress has been made, there is still limited or thin compliance in terms of promoting substantial democratization, decentralization, social justice, human rights and gender equality, peace and conflict resolution, and economic development. In terms of recommendations from our February assessment, it appears that when it comes to addressing the challenges identified, it is possible to combine amendments of the Constitution with the passage of new laws, amendments of existing laws, administrative reforms in specific agencies, and stricter implementation of laws already in place to achieve many of the goals of the Constitution. In terms of the second rapid assessment that we did, focusing on the assessment of the Constitution now that we have COVID, we found out that areas that were already identified as problematic in the assessment findings, including the exercise of separation of powers and checks and balances, the issue of citizenship and rights and labor rights, are indeed proving to be so, and even areas where we saw positive performance during the previous assessment, they are being challenged as a result of the pandemic. Despite the challenges, we also noted that there are some positive innovations, particularly in the judiciary and local government sectors, that could provide inspiration for more institutional policies and programs that could improve performance on key goals of the Constitution, such as decentralization and autonomy, as well as social justice. I'll try to, given the limited time, pinpoint some of these openings or opportunities. In terms of what can be done, while the future of the amendment process is currently on hold or unsure as a result of the pandemic, it remains critical to continually assess the ways in which the 1987 Constitution is fulfilling its goals and the ways in which it is being challenged. This can allow for sub-constitutional changes and innovations, like some of the practices and reforms discussed in the discussion paper on COVID and in the constitutional performance assessment done earlier, that can further constitutional performance in the absence of formal constitutional change. From a political science perspective and a new institutionalist perspective, I would like to, of course, highlight some of the threats that have been also identified not only by our constitutional performance assessment, but also by the global monitor as presented earlier by Amanda. But at the same time also, there's also an opportunity structure available that will allow for participation of different sectors, particularly the youth, in promoting or actually protecting democracy. And we have seen how the legislature has not been holding the executive accountable. We have seen how the pandemic has exposed the dominance of the executive, the office of the president, and the different agencies. The judiciary is still being attacked as an institution, and there are attacks on individual members of the judiciary. Accountability institutions like the Commission on Appointments are there, but they are, of course, can be very slow in terms of holding certain institutions accountable. Various local governments are finding it difficult now to actually move and meet the requirements of the pandemic, as well as the usual responsibilities allocated to them. We have seen how rights in terms of freedom of the press, freedom of information, as well as the rights of people who are usually identified as part of the opposition are being attacked. We see the disproportionate role of the military and of the other security sector in a pandemic where there should be more civilian and health-oriented activities. We see how various labor groups, including our overseas Filipino workers, have been hit hard by the pandemic, but at the same time also how their rights are still being threatened by responses of the government. And definitely we see social inequality, which has always been there but has been exposed further by the pandemic. However, we can also see that the period of the pandemic has also resulted in a number of innovations or discussions about innovations that can be openings for more participation of different sectors and the youth. For instance, discussions about electoral reforms, how we can make elections safer, more equitable, and more competitive, but at the same time more accessible and safer for different sectors. We are seeing how, despite the threats to the judiciary, people are going to the judiciary. Different sectors are making their demands for the judiciary to act on very important issues, including the Anti-Terrorism Act. We have seen the judiciary actually implementing reforms that have already been thought of before, but as a result of the pandemic, they have now digitized many of its processes. We have seen a number of local governments that have also stepped up and where we see a lot of innovations. We have also seen different groups, including youth groups, that are actually working with different communities to actually deal with the problems of the pandemic. So I think, and many of our youth panelists here can share what they are actually doing both online and offline in actually dealing with many of the challenges, but at the same time trying to deal with the problems of the pandemic. And I guess at this point, while the goal of the constitutional performance assessment was more institutional, it's important to talk about the idea that while the Constitution is there, as supposed to be a symbol of democratization and the revival of democracy in the Philippines. In any constitution worldwide, a constitution will only work if both elites and the people respect and work for democracy and promote these changes. And I think at this point, the youth sector is a very important group that will have to make sure that there is proper information available about the Constitution. A proper assessment of the Constitution should be made periodically. And what are the openings and opportunities for change, both institutionally and in terms of implementation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ella. Those were certainly interesting, to say the least, and thought-provoking presentation. And I agree that while there are definitely threats to democratic principles and values, it's good to also focus on the opportunities presented by these challenges. That this can serve as openings for participation of various sectors, especially the youth. So we will have time to address any questions that you may have so far with our speakers. Please do write down your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to it after our next portion of the program. So now let us proceed to another exciting part of our webinar. This time we will hear the thoughts and ideas and experiences from our youth representatives, all of whom are quite engaged in their respective advocacies. So let me first introduce who we have in the panel. For this session, we have 5 very interesting and engaged youth representatives. So may I please first introduce Dr. RJ Nagit, the founder and national chairperson of the Youth for Mental Health Coalition and the national chairperson of Akbayan Youth, the youth wing of the Akbayan Citizens Action Party, a socialist, feminist, ecological political party in the Philippines. RJ is, sorry RJ, you have a long bio, so let me go through that. So RJ is a Filipino activist, a nurse, a medical doctor, and a mental health advocate. So he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing in 2012 and a Doctor of Medicine in 2017 from the University of Santo Tomas. He is currently pursuing a Master's in Community Development from the University of the Philippines. Probably, RJ, you want to say hello first to our participants?
All right, so hello everyone, and thank you for inviting us here to share some insights about democracy. This is a very interesting topic for us also, because of course, as an activist and as a political organization, we're very much invested in these kinds of initiatives.
Thank you, RJ. I'll get back to you shortly. We also have in the panel Vince Renzo Liban, the national convener for PANTAY. PANTAY stands for Philippine Anti-Discrimination Alliance of Youth Leaders. So Vince is a human rights advocate and student leader advocating for democracy, gender equality, and youth empowerment. He finished his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in 2015 and currently pursuing a master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of the Philippines. He's also a member of Akbayan Youth and currently the national convener of PANTAY, a national network of young Filipinos campaigning for the passage of the SOGI Equality Bill in Congress and gender equality and non-discrimination in the Philippines. So perhaps you can see Vince quickly. Vince, are you? Okay. Hi, Vince.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Glad that you're able to join us. Okay. Then we also have in our panel Kira Velasco, the chairperson of Amarela Philippines. Kira is a senior high school in the STEM strand and the chairperson of Amarela Philippines, a youth-led initiative that advocates for sexual and reproductive healthcare. Kira also advocates for reproductive awareness, healthcare, women's rights, LGBTQIA rights, and press freedom. Kira, Can we
Good
quickly see
afternoon,
you?
everyone.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to speak in this wonderful discussion with all the other youth participants.
Okay. Thank you, Kira. I'll get back to you shortly. Okay. Then we also have Robin Camille Mijares, the Executive Director of Youth Uprising. Robin is the founder and executive director of Youth Uprising, a non-profit youth organization that supports the youth in creating a positive change towards some more inclusive, fair, and sustainable communities. Can probably see Robin on the screen.
Hi.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited for the conversation we're going to have.
Okay, nice to have you here. Okay, and last but not the least, we have Sohaila Makadato, a project officer of UNIFIL Women. UNIFIL stands for United Youth of the Philippines, a nonprofit women youth organization with chapters both in Luzon and the Mindanao region. The primary goal of UNIFIL Women is to assist women who are subjected to violence, sexual and physical abuses, trafficking, and other forms of discrimination. Sohaila is based in Cotabato City and has previously worked with a volunteer service organization or VSO and a USAID-funded project on governance and accountability. So welcome, Sohaila.
Hello, good afternoon to all. It is nice to be here also, and I am so excited to share our learning with our communities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Nice to have you here. Okay, so I'd have some questions on hand, and probably the first one I will address to RJ. RJ, how would you describe the Philippine democracy before and currently with the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of things that we should be worried about with regard to the Philippine democracy right now. And I'd like to say that the threats have been started since 2016 when President Duterte actually came into power. And of course, we have to look at it from an institutional level as well as individual level. So at the institutional level, we have seen different attacks to our democratic institutions. The Commission on Human Rights have been threatened several times for it to become defunded. And then we also saw the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court before removed already. And of course, this also enjoys the backing of the supermajority in the House of Representatives. So it's a very big concern, especially if we're going to talk about the checks and balances that we have right now in government. And earlier, Secretary Casas talked about sustainable democracy. And I think this is also a very important concept that we need to address, especially if we're going to talk about the translation of political democracy to economic democracy. Because right now, what we're seeing is that we're having elections, but it's still controlled by the elites, the political as well as economic elites, which later on has an impact in terms of our general state of democracy. So if you want to realize the fruits of democracy, then I think it should be enjoyed by everyone, not just a very small population of the society. And of course, we have also seen several instances where critiques were silenced. So we have a senator already jailed because of trumped-up drug-related charges. We have members of the opposition filed sedition cases, and even our own party chairperson was barraged with a lot of cases related to the drug war. And of course, there's also harassment of media through Rappler as well as ABS-CBN. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, all of these have actually worsened. So, and it's very telling because the agency that was formed by the government to respond to the pandemic is formed by retired military officials, which leads to more militarized responses rather than public health oriented ones. And of course, despite the Filipinos facing several risks like hunger, joblessness, and even health and political risks, the Congress even passed the anti-terrorism law, which allowed the government to actually name anyone as a terrorist. And this is a very big threat to us, especially if we're going to talk about dissent as well as those who are fighting for human rights and democracy. And of course, another issue that we're facing right now is the attack on press freedom. So ABS-CBN, one of the largest media networks, was shut down. And this produced a chilling effect not only on other big networks, but also to student media publications. And even for those who have been expressing their opinions online, some of them have been summoned by the National Bureau of Investigation, as well as some of them are shamed by their local government units. And some of the activists that we have been working with have been arrested, and some of them we've also seen that there are cases that they have been killed. So this is a very big issue right now in the Philippines. And the thing that really worries me a lot is the continuing narrowing of the space of democracy, as well as for dissent and dialogue. So I think these are very important concepts of democracy that we should all be defending right now.
Thank you for that, RJ. So Hyla, I wanted to ask if you have the same concerns, or what be most worrying from your perspective, especially you're from the Bangsamoro region.
Yes, Ma'am Naila. I will be more specific, I think, on the local region in the Bangsamoro because it's our context, right? And I think, yeah, it's somehow similar to Sir RJ mentioned that actually in the Bangsamoro, we have membership in parties declining somehow because we are now facing the newly formed government that we have. And also we have the less representation of social groups and less consistent and ineffective nowadays because aside from we are in the transition period, we are also facing the COVID-19 pandemic in our region. So somehow we've been struggling on how we can actually, women especially and youth can participate and ensure our participation in the transition period of BAR because we so it is very important for us to really participate on this transition period because this is the time that the policies, guidelines, and laws will be made by our parliament. So it is very important for us. And also we have this kind of public opinion towards parties because nowadays we only have one parties in the Bangsamoro. So somehow it's challenging that how we can, our women and our young people can engage them to somehow create or establish parties for them to really participate on our newly formed of government. And of course, yes, it's the same in the Philippines context. We are being dominated by political economic elite and also built around some personalities rather than around political programs or platforms that we can actually participate with. And also, I think there are underdeveloped political party system because we actually call it as Balimbing Party. So we somehow we want know more to see it as the programs, the platforms that they have, and not at their political name as party. But we're more specific on the programs and platforms that they are actually advocating for. And of course, I think there are also weak membership bases of our because there's a lot of political parties in the Philippines, but in our region we don't see to it as a opportunity for us on how we actually gonna see these political parties basically on what they stand for, or the other one will stand another for this kind of party. So somehow it's confusing for us young people in the Bangsamoro. And of course, we want also to see somehow we actually see the absence of general party law in the Philippines, and I think it's a very struggling part for us as a youth and women individual in our region to really connect with our national parties or democratic system. So somehow we're really looking forward for our women and youth to be included in our democracy.
Okay,
So
thank you so
thank you
much for
very
that,
much.
Sohaila. Thank you. Thank you. So probably we will go to Vince Liban since you're working in the Congress. I was wondering, in your opinion, what would be the priority areas that the government should focus on to further strengthen the Philippine democracy, especially against the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you. First, I'd like to begin that ever since we transitioned to a democracy in 1986, the challenge has always been to deepen it the Philippine democracy has always been vulnerable. Despite the best efforts of the 1987 Constitution, many democratic policies remain unimplemented. There is the absence of the anti-dynasty law. The electoral system remains prone to abuse of the ruling class. We have party lists that claim to represent LPG, among many others, and the lack of civil society participation and a weak political party system to begin with. And now we are encountering disinformation efforts and the demonization of human rights amidst the pandemic. So I think at this point, in the middle of a pandemic, the Philippine government should focus more of its efforts in strengthening public health policies. During this crisis, the situation of the marginalized groups are also aggravated. PWD groups, the elderly, senior citizens, children are facing greater barriers access to health services. There's also cases of degrading treatment to queer individuals who allegedly violated curfew. People were made to perform lewd acts in Pampanga. Trans women and queer individuals were arrested or punished by cutting their hair in Zamboanga City. There's also social isolation, the lack of access to better health services. There's a problem in employment. There is an increased number of cases of people experiencing mental health problems, not to mention the invisibility of and sometimes inclusion of queer people in research and indices of democracy. But in terms of policy, I think a huge part where the government should come in really is to engage civil society better, because we have seen the rise of civil society and the weak government coordination, the ailing public health system, a malleable education system, a regressive public transportation and mobility, and a worsening environment and climate crisis. So there are a lot of issues that the government should address, and the COVID-19, despite the difficulties of addressing it, also presents an opportunity to look at these issues in terms of causes of human rights, or causes or policies that involve human rights. So I hope the government should also practice not demonizing human rights and democracy at this point.
Okay, thank you, Vince. I take note that one of the things that you think that the government should do is to engage more civil society. So I want to ask Robin, perhaps, since she, yeah.
Hi. So,
Hi, Robin. Robin can, I just want to, probably just a follow-up question to what Vince said about the what could be the priority of civil society in terms of strengthening the Philippine democracy. What can you say about that?
Well, because of the health risks, it has limited the movement of people, thus posing a risk in limited engagement and discussions. So I guess the worst fear is that important key decisions are being made by just a few and not the majority. So especially to the youth, where we're not even encouraged or allowed to go out at all. It made it harder for us to participate in things. But I will admit that we are not completely helpless, especially during this time where others could add on this. But what I have observed is there is actually a rise in youth organizations, not only in numbers, but in activities during this pandemic. And I think it's really because this generation is so tech savvy, and even before the pandemic happened. And I think that's one of the strengths. And it's amazing to see that the youth are still trying to participate and help by using their strengths, by them being able to adapt to online conversations and such.
Okay, that's quite interesting, Robin. And it's also, good to know. I didn't realize that, it's good to note that there's been a rise of youth organizations during the pandemic for whatever reason, but at least there's more engagement. And you're right, with this generation, with the social media, it's quite timely and relevant. So probably, Kira, could I ask you to give your thoughts on what you think the youth can contribute in terms of protecting the values of Philippine democracy. You can discuss if looking at it at the local or national level.
I think that the youth has lots of opportunities, especially right now. Like what Robin said, there has been a steady rise in youth organizations and youth participation because in the pandemic, personally, I've seen lots of injustices that I believe that I can correct as a teenager in the Philippine scope. So I think one way the youth can really protect our democracy is really through education. And once we've been given the proper resources and the proper opportunities to engage in political discussions or to be more educated when it comes to the politics of the Philippines, we can really protect our democracy because we see what needs to be done and what can be done in the future because as everyone knows, the youth is really the future of our country, and the decisions that the leaders make now will affect our future greatly. And if you limit the access of youth when it comes to civic participation and political participation, you limit our access to our future and you limit our decision-making process as well as a chance for us to really grow into our leadership and to really grow into our values as the future of the Philippines. So like what I said, education and really opening up the opportunities, not just during the pandemic, but especially after, once things have gone back to normal as possible, making sure that you encourage the youth in your family or the youth in your circles to really participate in processes such as voting, encouraging more people to register to vote, especially for the upcoming elections, really does a lot in protecting our democracy because it is our future. And I've seen the youth really wants to protect the future and really wants to correct the injustices as long as we're given the opportunities to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Kira. As a follow-up question to you and to all our panelists, talking about providing education and more resources and opportunities to the youth, what do you think? How do you think the international community can help in this regard? Probably in terms of supporting the youth in protecting Philippine democracy, or just protecting Philippine democracy in general?
I think one good example is actually holding webinars like this, because without opportunities like this, people like me, I'm fairly young and I've never seen or been given this opportunity before. And it was really amazing to see this invitation come through to Amarella because it came from an international organization and it wasn't something I thought would be possible, especially now. So really giving resources such as webinars like this or information like the papers that UP writes in terms of like what's happening in the pandemic right now when it comes to democracy, and internationally, I think just helping the youth like be able to identify where their government, wherever they are, like where the government is really waning when it comes to democracy. So like helping helping the government see like where they can improve when it comes to democracy and really giving the assistance that both the people and the government needs when it comes to things like this.
Okay, thank you so much, Kira. Does any of the other panelists would like to add to that? How do you think the international community can help the youth in protecting Philippine democracy?
Hi, I just like to add on that. I totally agree with Kira. And I would, for me, international relations is very important. And in two ways, which is one, the influence and how they can actually leverage from the best practices from countries where democracy is fully manifested and where the youth are encouraged to participate in all aspects of society. And the second is in providing support to us. So there is already countries doing this, such as countries giving grants specifically to youth organizations. So as because I believe that resources is one of the enablers to starting activities and initiatives. So another way that countries could help is providing education and awareness. An example of this, which is like the Swedish Institute actually, that provides scholarships to Filipinos to help them be more educated and be more aware of not just the problems in the Philippines or in the Asia Pacific, but in how that relates globally. And through this scholarship, they provide like networks of peoples and organizations that could talk about problems and these issues. So then again, they help with resources and education. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Robin. Anybody else who wants to add to that?
I would like to add.
Okay, go ahead, RJ.
Yeah, because what we're seeing right now is that the attacks on democracy as well as the rise of populism is happening at a global scale. I think it's important to continue to express solidarity with the different organizations at an international level, to hold joint discussions, release solidarity statements if there are specific threats that are happening in one country, as well as map out ways on how to support human rights defenders. And I think with the recent developments, with the passage of the Magnitsky Act in the EU, as well as the different cases that have been filed towards our leaders in the Philippines, I think those are some of the issues that we might want to support and develop joint campaigns on. And I think it's also important for us to take inspiration from the different social movements. And I'm very happy that we're sharing the space here with gender advocates as well as women's rights advocates, because we have to understand that these issues are also very pertinent, especially if we're going to talk about addressing democracy. And moving forward, coming into 2022, that's actually an election year in the Philippines. We have to also learn to actually take power and capture power away from those who are not compatible with democracy, as well as field our own set of candidates. And I think since reversing the threats of democracy is a very long haul, since most of the attacks are based on institutions, I think we have to develop that kind of stamina for us to keep on with the initiatives that we're doing right now. So burnout, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness and helplessness are something that I already see in some of the youth advocates. So I think there has to be some level of psychosocial support that should also be given to those who are fighting for democracy and human rights.
If I may add.
Okay, go ahead, Vince.
All right, I think young people all around the world are taking up and reclaiming political spaces. And the Filipino youth will continue to take up this helm and will not falter. The same way when we were one of the first countries to transition to democracy in 1986, during the third wave of democratization, international organizations need to support young people and civil society groups who advocate for democracy and human rights. I think just what Dr. Nagit mentioned, we should establish international cooperation and solidarity. Democracy demands to be felt, and civil society and the people need to feel that democratic institutions are at work and are working for them.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Vince. So this is a very dynamic discussion. I'm so happy that we have this kind of youth discussants quite engaged with the topics at hand. Probably it's the best time also to engage our participants, our audience. I think we have some questions already on the Q&A board. So let me just read through them and let's see what we can discuss next. So I think the first question is on the COVID-19 presentation of Amanda. So Saskia De Lang is asking how the Philippines COVID response compares to the response in other Southeast Asian countries in democratic terms. Amanda, are you able to?
One at a time.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you for the question. I think to answer more deeply, I would refer you all to the website, as I said earlier, which can give you a sense of, you can compare the Philippines to any country that you want around the world, but also regional comparisons and sub-regional comparisons in terms of looking specifically at Southeast Asia. But I think the main point in response to this question is, first of all, that the Philippines has had quite a bad pandemic numbers wise for the region. So currently, I think it's second in Asia for a number of cases. The geography of the Philippines also makes the response very difficult, and the structures of local government and of power there. But I think to look at how it compares to other countries, it's important to look at how countries were performing before the pandemic. So we see very similar trends continuing. If you look, for example, at Cambodia, was already in a state where democracy was quite under threat, and now is also the state of emergencies and use of state of emergencies there has been questionable. So I think it's not to say that how a country has responded has necessarily changed democratically how they're performing in relation to other countries, but really I think the rankings of the countries have moved in parallel with each other. So countries that were already backsliding have continued to backslide, as I mentioned, for the Philippines itself, and that's true for most of the countries around Southeast Asia. So we're seeing similar rights violations and in different countries based on what they were experiencing before the pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. I think the next question is addressed to any of the panelists pertaining to threats and publicly red tagging student journalists, especially with the shutdown of the ABS-CBN. So the question is that how do you think the colleges and universities can better protect the student press? And do you think that they're doing enough in this regard? So who among the panelists would want to respond to this? I think we can only accommodate one, if that's okay. Probably RJ, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, of course, I think universities need to take a very proactive stance in terms of ensuring that their students are actually do have the right in terms of speaking up, and also protecting universities as areas or spaces where we can actually critically discuss certain issues. So I think the universities need to really come together to actually have a certain stance in terms of red tagging as well as other attacks on human rights. And I think, of course, this is actually progressive realization, especially if we're going to talk about how universities will do this. But I think the universities are taking steps actually to safeguard the well-being of their students right now. But it has to also come in consultation with the different schools and universities as well as students.
Okay, thank you, RJ. Perhaps I can also ask Sohaila if she has some thoughts on that question, just to give some perspective from the BARM region. Sohaila?
Yes, I think in our region, we really have to highly promote the social media literacy, advocacy, especially in our youth, because in our localities, we're prone on having this fake news in our news feeds, social media, and everywhere. Social media fake news is very common to us. So I think we really have to encourage our young people to really engage with the kind of social media literacy advocates and make their platforms be significant to our fellow youth, especially to our student publications and academies, and also with our local radio programs are actually doing their social media advocacy awareness. And I think that's a good thing also that our youth in the local can join for that platform. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Sohaila. There's a question here from Sir Louis Gia, former commissioner of COMELEC, that for the 2022 elections, he anticipates that more intelligent votes will come from the youth. Yeah, I'm hopeful as well. However, the election is going to be held within the school year. How do you think it would affect the youth participation in the election? Any of the panelists would like to respond to that? Perhaps Kira?
Actually, what I see right now when it comes to the youth participating in the elections, lots of people are actually, those who are going to be 18 before the May elections are registering to vote despite the pandemic. Lots of my classmates have been registered as a voter already. So I think from that experience only, like they're already going out of their way to make sure that they are able to participate in these sort of political processes. So even if it will be during the school year, lots of people will go out of their way and do whatever they can to make sure that they vote, because as youth, we see the importance in exercising our right to vote and really having a say in who we want our next leaders to be and who we want to lead us into a better future.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kira. We are running out of time, but I think we have enough time to answer one more question, and I think this will be a good way to close the discussion. There's a question from John Paul Matthew Guzman. His concern is that how do we engage the youth more, especially from the marginalized sector of the society, especially not all of the young people have access, like for example, the infrastructure that most of us enjoy. Hence, their appreciation of democracy may not be as strong or as informed as of the participants we have now. So what would be your suggestions on how, or recommendation on how we engage them?
Hi, can I answer this question?
Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
Okay, so I understand it's easy to empower everyone, but it is hard, especially to think of situations, especially in the marginalized, where in some cases, why would they think to help others if they still can't help themselves? So in these situations, it's really, I personally still don't have the answer, and it's hopefully we do, but we can't solve it alone. So what I can say to every youth listening here right now, no matter where they come from, to remember the three things, which is first, educate yourselves. You have to know the problem just in arm's reach, in your communities, in your schools, in your homes, and then look for solutions there. And two is find your supporters and support others. You have to create this community. It doesn't matter where they're from, what age they are. You have to continue to reach out to people, change them as well. And the third is act on it. Do not just get inspired by it. For me to say to have courage would be an understatement, because it's easy to say have courage, but if it was easy, everyone would have done it. So, but it's not. So we have to just work hard. Don't let age define you, because when you're young, that's when things are actually more amazing, and people will actually be more in awe and more inspired by, if she can do it, then I can. So that's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Very well said. Okay, so unfortunately, and I'm really sad to close this discussion, as we still have very good questions, but together with the embassy and UPCIDS, we'll take this into account, and just to probably let you know that we will provide also, aside from providing the presentations presented today, we'll do a report of the webinar, and this will be made available on our website of the organizer. So please watch out for that. Anyway, so before I hand over the floor to the next speaker, I've been asked to, quickly hand over to Athena first for a quick screenshot photo group session of this webinar. Athena, would you like to handle this?
Okay, just for our record keeping, I want to ask all of our speakers to turn on their camera, and I'll take a quick screenshot. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, we have it now. So we can proceed to our closing and synthesis. If I can, I'll go ahead and introduce Lina for our quick closing and synthesis as well.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is yours, Lina.
Thank you so much, Athena, and thank you, Naila. And I feel terrible to cut short such a fascinating discussion that we have had, particularly the part where you young people have been talking about the future of democracy in the Philippines and how does it look from your perspective. We learned from many speakers, from yourselves as well, that there are a number of aspects that we need to be worried about in the Philippines, particularly so from public health, democracy, and human rights perspective. But at the same time, there is so much positive energy, even during these darkest of times, and also innovations emerging that we should focus on and work to support. At the same time, obviously, we cannot close our eyes on these challenges and democratic declines regarding functioning of institutions such as Parliament, Congress, opposition, role of opposition, restrictions of individual freedoms and rights, press freedom, and what was discussed about the overly, perhaps militarized response to COVID-19, and potentially the long-term consequences of these restrictions and measures taken in the name of COVID-19 in terms of gender equality, and increased social and economic inequality, and also the implications to the mental health that was brought up during the discussion. And that's of course a worry for the young generation entering to the workforce or wanting to pursue further future studies. And despite all these challenges and problems, I'm hearing a lot of optimism as well, which again gives also us hope and drive us to support you in your work and in this work. There was number one, we learned also from Professor Ela, there is some scope and space for improving the court processes, reforms in the judiciary, including related to human rights. And I also would like to take this opportunity to commend the work of the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines that is doing for everything that they are doing every day. And in spite of the challenges that Shuhaila, you also mentioned in Bangsamoro, we also have perhaps a lot of reason to remain optimistic about Bangsamoro and the case for autonomy and the Bangsamoro youth really taking it all forward. Also, so inspiring to hear about the rise of youth organizations and activities, and youth in particular making the use of whatever means, often digital, through the social media to try to influence decision-making, while recognizing the need to protect the student media, student journalists, and the worry about the continuing narrowing space for dissent and dialogue. And of course, there was a mention of a need to refocus on long-awaited electoral reforms and address the issues of political dynasties. You all know that the elections, next elections are scheduled on 2022 in the Philippines. And while every country would need to make their decisions about whether it is safe to organize elections or not, I think it has been proven now that it is possible to do so even under the pandemic, when certain conditions are met and of course precautions taken. We had the examples from Korea, but also from the less resourced countries like Mongolia and Sri Lanka, and very recently in Myanmar this November. And we all find a lot of hope in the role of youth and your voices in holding elected leaders to account. And I can only encourage you, your participation in political processes, both when it comes to formal positions, as well as then through civil society, media, and as students. And I really want to thank you all, particularly the youth panelists, for your contributions. RJ Nakit, Vince Liban, Kira Velasco, Suhaila Macadato, and Robin Mijares. And thanks also the UP, CIDS for another fruitful partnership, and particularly Professor Ela Atienza, but also Yesam Jimenez and the entire team at the Program for Social and Political Change. And I do want to take this opportunity as well to congratulate Embassy of Sweden, Ambassador Harald Fries and Athena Cartagena for your lead in conducting this democracy talk in Manila. We are very glad that International IDEA was able to contribute to Sweden's global initiative on Drive for Democracy. And I want to, at the last, I really want to thank you for the great ideas on how we could possibly be of support. And you emphasized sharing and solidarity with your peers and with the other social movements. Also such an important point came up about the providing support on when it comes to mental health. And we at International IDEA, I'm sure can speak on behalf of the Embassy of Sweden too, we will continue our work in the Philippines, providing whatever support we can through technical advice, providing you with comparative knowledge, and maybe also capacity building programs. And we look forward to future engagement with the youth representatives. And while bearing very much in mind, as Robin said, that it's not enough to be inspired, we really need to act on what we say as well, and that should apply to international community as well. Last but not least, I wanted to mention that there will be a report from this webinar, and it will be made available, hopefully already by January, perhaps early February 2021. Thank you everyone who joined us today, and I hope you enjoyed this democracy talk. And if you are in the Philippines, I hope you will have a wonderful rest of your public holiday. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks to everyone. This has been a wonderful event. I really enjoyed it, particularly the strong and important messages from our youth participants.
Yes, I agree. I think probably Ambassador, we should think of a, a follow-up discussion. It was really nice. I think there's more to say.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you. Good day. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To everyone. Good job.